Today we have our Professor Louis-Philippe Rochon, professor from the University Laurentian University. I will give a brief overview of his resume. So he is editor of a review of political economy, founding editor of review of Keynesian economics. He has several books and articles published in very high quality journals. His fields of interest is monetary policy and post-Keynesian economics. And today he will present a talk, and the title is Pre, Post, and Beyond, Holistic Reflections on Capitalism and COVID-19. Thanks, Professor, for accepting our invitation. Usually people speak about 1 hour and then we open to questions, but feel free to give a lecture a little bit longer or not. Feel free to decide, okay? Thanks very much.
Thank you. It may be a bit shorter because I didn't know how long I was supposed to speak, and usually I'm asked to speak 30 minutes or so, but I'll see. We'll see what happens. Thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be speaking to you. I think I've been to Porto Alegre twice, maybe at least once, but maybe twice. Yeah, twice. And I visited your campus and spoke at your campus, and this is where I've met one of your former students called Silvio Capes, who is now at the University of Sierra, and I'm working a lot with him on various projects. He's a very, if all your students are of his quality, you have a very fine university indeed. So today I want to talk a little bit about COVID. It's sort of an inevitable topic. I edited 2 issues on COVID, one in the International Journal of Political Economy that I co-edited with Mario Secareccia, and one issue, and that came out in December 2020, and one issue in Rope, my journal, out next week or something like that. And in the Rope issue, we have a few people from Brazil, in fact, someone called Maria Goes. I think she's at Rio. But anyways, so there's quite a number of papers, and I've thought a lot about COVID, like everyone else. And one thing, now that we're sort of at the end of COVID, questions about the recovery. And this is what the beyond is in this talk today. And in making the PowerPoint for this presentation, and on reflecting on what is beyond, what are the policies for beyond, I kept coming back to heterodox economics, that it has proven to be very resilient in terms of theory. It is a theory that is well suited for the analysis of what happened. Mainstream, and I'll talk a little bit about this, mainstream economists mainly have what's called fair weather models, right? Models of convergences and stability, and not a lot of room for instability, although they're getting a little bit better. But everything that has come out that's sensible in the mainstream really borrows heavily from Keynesian economics. And this is goes to show, if Bob Skidelsky was writing a book about the return of the master, it would have to be called something like a triumphant return of the master, or something like that, because we really saw a lot of Keynesian economics. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about pre-COVID, um, and then about the COVID crisis itself, and then a little bit about the policies that we need to do about moving forward, about opening up the economy, recovering from this crisis. And while my remarks will be mainly about developed economies, maybe in the discussion we can open it up as well to developing economies. Um, there is a couple coming out, in fact, in my series, New Directions in Post-Keynesian Economics, about post-COVID policies in Latin America. And so there will be a richness of analysis. Once again, it comes down to what post-Keynesians and the heterodox have been discussing for quite a long time. So let me now share my screen. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I just want to mention a few other things apart from the two journals. Um, I edit a series of books on central banking and monetary policy with Silvio Capes, by the way. And this is a series of 10 books on monetary policy. And we'll be dealing with various topics from one book to another. So central banking, monetary policy, and gender, and income distribution, and electronic bitcoins, money, gender, did I say gender? And things of that nature. So we'll be dealing with, and the environment. So we'll be dealing with a lot of topics related to central banking and trying to push post-Keynesians, the research agenda on central banking in various directions. And also the New Directions in Post-Keynesian Economics is a series I started some years ago. And finally, the Monetary Policy Institute, which is I created a few years, about a year ago, at the beginning of the crisis. And this is an institute that is focused on monetary matters. And we currently have about 15 projects on the go, including one on monetary policy and asset inflation, a book co-edited by Capes and Andres Arauz, the former presidential candidate in Ecuador, on dollarization, the political economy of dollarization, and a number of other central banking in Africa and COVID, and a few other projects, including one led by Fernando and his book. And I think that you guys have a similar institute in Brazil as well, I saw recently. So hopefully maybe in the future we can collaborate. So let's briefly talk about pre-COVID economics. I can see three major periods or eras. The 1929 depression and crisis. I won't talk much about that. That's more in terms of history, economic history. This was a Keynesian crisis of aggregate demand. And so we move on from there to the Keynesian era. So, was this Keynes inspired, the policies that emanated from that? Many people think of a central policy of that era is FDR's uh, uh, deal to launch the economy. We know that Keynes was very critical of that deal. It thought that the government spending was way too low. But nevertheless, it was more or less a mixed economy dominated by so-called Keynesian or bastard Keynesian ideas. It recognized some role for governments, some focus on communities and social groups. This was the era of, at least in Canada and the United States and parts of Europe, This was the era of social programs in Canada, healthcare and Medicare and other programs of the sort. But there was this idea that the community, the idea of a community, the idea of that if I got sick, others were there to pay for my uh, my getting better. Unemployment insurance, the idea if I lost my job, there would be a pool of resources from members of the community to support my income during my periods of loss. So it was this sort of idea of we're all in it together. This was a period definitely dominated by fiscal policy, both in terms of theory but also in practice, policy practice. We had a focus on unemployment. There was some discussion of full employment policies, regulated trade and financial markets, Stiegel Glass Bill, for example. This was an era of consumption driven capitalism. And the major challenge of that period arose in the 1970s with the oil crisis. So the oil supply shock side of the economy, and largely a Keynesian era. And with the oil crisis, of course, came the collapse of the Keynesian consensus in terms of policies and in terms of theory. And that led to the Friedman or the neoliberal era, or what Polanyi called the neoliberal creed. And here we had a reversal of a lot of Keynesian ideas. Less role for government, less regulations, austerity policy, focus on individualism, not the social group. It was about reducing taxes so I can have a higher disposable income. Uh, so, with fiscal policy in the background, it was the rise of monetary policy, the idea that monetary policy was the only policy that mattered, that could get the jobs done. The focus shifted away from unemployment to inflation. This was the era of the adoption of inflation targeting, with perhaps weight to unemployment gaps, but certainly a heavier weight towards the inflation gap and an official inflation target or unofficial. This was certainly the rise of finance, trade liberalization, financial liberalization across the world. As I said, deregulated commodity and financial markets. The Washington Consensus sort of embedded that philosophy. And this was certainly the era of debt fueled consumption. So there was an explosion of household debt, which certainly fueled a boom during the early years, certainly, in the late 90s, 2000s. But the problem with household debt, of course, is that it is not sustainable. Eventually, that debt must be reimbursed. And that is simply pushing back to a later date a deflationary period. And the major challenge of that area sort of came to a head with the financial crisis of 2007. Um, but that was temporary because whereas there was a brief flirtation with Keynesian policies in 2000, let's say not 2007, 8, 2009, that was short lived. Um, um, there was adoption of Keynesian style policies around the world. But in 2010, at the G20, governments across the world agreed to go back to austerity policies. And so, whatever Keynesian flirtation was very short lived, which was, I called here, the great fiscal U turn. And so this was more or less from 2007 to, let's say, today or last year pre-COVID, a lost decade in terms of stagnation. So this was a period of long-term secular stagnation in a Keynesian sense, not in a sense explained by Lawrence Summers, but very much a crisis in aggregate demand, a crisis in income inequality, which leads to a crisis in demand. Um, and the question of whether this, a lot of people mentioned a K recovery, and certainly this was the case after the crisis. Financial markets rebounded quite well, finance rebounded quite well, but wages remained stagnant. And so when I spoke in Mexico at UNAM in 2008, I spoke of Hilferding and the dual economy. And this was sort of the beginning or the rise of the concept of a dual economy, a profit economy, which I called it, and a wage economy. And interestingly enough, I know a lot of people in the banking industry and finance world, and they were joking to me in 2000, as early in 2010. What financial crisis? They were all very happy. Markets had rebounded for them. And in fact, if you went to a number of professional economic conferences like the Easterns or the American Economic Association, starting in 2010, there were very few papers on the financial crisis. It was back. Um, it was back to usual sort of uh, pre-crisis papers. So the economic profession moved away from the financial crisis, and largely because in the they lived in a theory void. They didn't know quite how to analyze the crisis, how to propose policies for the crisis. You had a few that were sort of dissident mainstream people that did quite well, but for the vast majority, the profession moved away from the crisis and it became a business as usual. But the crisis was sort of a watershed moment uh, because, first of all, it showed that developed economies were not immune to financial crises. Um, Financial crisis before 2007 was something that developing countries, Latin America had. And why? Well, because you were, poorly managed and fiscally irresponsible. Hence the reason the Washington Consensus was developed. The idea that we had to um, transform Latin America into more of a mirror of how things were done here in developed economies, because, hey, we got it right. We don't have financial crises. So I think that 2007 was certainly a watershed moment um, for the profession. Whether it sank in is another question. I think they had moved away from the crisis shortly after. But nevertheless, it was a period, a lost period for the working class, and this was a rare a rare occasion for us to face such a dramatic collapse of the economy. Now, uh, the financial crisis of 2007 was certainly um, an endogenous sort of a crisis. So we can go back to the policies that were adopted from, let's say, 1980, if we use that as the year of where neoliberalism began, the election of Thatcher in 79, Reagan in 1980. So there was a political shift, an economic shift, all of that. But if the financial crisis was very much the result of uh, some 30 years of neoliberal policies, austerity, increasing inequality, um, etc. And so that eventually, in my opinion, led to a crisis. I think that that was certainly a result of increasing inequality that led to this crisis of aggregate demand. And Piketty graph, you know it, where he looks at the share of the 1% from 1920 to, at the time 2010, and we noticed that the income share right before the 1929 crisis and the 2007 crisis were, pretty much very high at same levels. And that was sort of an arbiter of doom, if you want, that led to both of these crises. But COVID was a very different crisis. First of all, it was not a crisis of aggregate demand. It was a health crisis that turned into a crisis of aggregate demand, of course. But at its very core, it was a health crisis, and many people sought to paint COVID-19 as an exogenous shock. And some post Keynesians raised the issue of whether that really was the case. What is an exogenous shock? What is exogenous? What factors can we identify that can truly be exogenous? In these days of environmental sensibility, it's difficult to identify true exogenous shocks. Maybe all shocks are sort of the result of environmental policies or deregulated policies or etc. And so some people raise the issue that maybe COVID was in fact uh, a crisis, an endogenous crisis to capitalism. And there are some um, theories out there, the linking it to environmentals, and I should say some very credible theories that link COVID to some sort of environmental issues. And so the point here is not to discuss these because we could certainly discuss them in great details, and I'm no specialist on this point. But I do want to raise the issue of whether COVID should be seen as an exogenous. I know that in the um, July issue of Rope, Riccardo Bellafiore makes that point that COVID should not be seen as an exogenous shock, but rather should be seen as a shock resulting from the crisis of capitalism. And this has sort of transformed our understanding of capitalism, where we see capitalism now, especially in this sort of neoliberal creed or Polanyi sort of creed, as capitalism simply is, you know, economies bopping from one crisis to another. And it raises the question not of whether we'll have another crisis, but rather when we will have another crisis. And certainly, I expect another crisis in my lifetime. Um, and so, if we see COVID not as a black swan, but as a sort of result of endogenous forces within capitalism, it sort of raises questions again about the usefulness of mainstream theories and especially their fair weather models. And granted that some DSG models have incorporated instability, I'm not sure that they've modeled it correctly. It seems to me that something has to trigger that instability is not fully an endogenous feature of the model. But I still think that mainstream have very little to offer in terms of analysis and policies about this COVID. Um, but I do think that COVID represented a complete rejection of the so-called neoliberal creed. And I'll get to that in a minute, or probably the next slide. So let's get a few things straight. This was a health crisis. This was not a Keynesian uh, demand crisis. Um, so governments sort of adopted policies of self-distancing. Workplaces were shut down as a result, especially in China, which then contributed to a supply shock, bottlenecks. So there was certainly a supply side, undeniable supply side. And and as employment levels fell, unemployment increased in some countries, not in all countries, but certainly in Canada and the United States, we had a dramatic increase. Um, and uh, Consumption collapsed, which starved modern financial economies of their essential fuel. So, as I said earlier before, financialized economies were largely consumption debt driven economies. Um, but um, but this was not the case because consumption was cut off. Um, and we see this pattern in many countries. And then at that point, with the increase in unemployment, collapse in income, collapse in consumption, this led to a crisis in aggregate demand. So there you have your crisis in aggregate demand, but it was still not a Keynesian crisis in aggregate demand, in the sense that while government embraced large stimulus, fiscal responses, this did not have the same effect as before, as in 2007, for example. Here, the purpose of fiscal policy was not to get the economy rolling, but simply to get the economy stable, to sustain the economy, to prevent further collapse. And in that sense, it had very little impact on economic activity. And so you had so this was a particular sort of um, crisis, because you had both a supply crisis, which lasted and still lasting, and a demand side that didn't respond quite the same way as in traditional Keynesian crises. Um, so there's a paper in Rope coming out on sort of interpreting the aggregate demand, aggregate supply sort of model in terms of COVID-19. Um, but nevertheless, there was a huge embrace of fiscal stimulus, public debts exploded, very uneven around the world, I must say. Canada responded incredibly. Our deficits went from $26 billion to $400 billion, and our debt exploded as well. Um, so we had, but that money in Canada was used to, and what Canada did is we nationalized wages. We nationalized the labor market. We paid companies to continue paying their workers while they were not working. I think we were paying something like seven incomes. And so, but that again, because you couldn't go out and consume, it didn't have that sort of multiplier effect. And I'll say a few words about that in a second. But it was very uneven because Mexico had very little support in terms of government intervention. And I'm not sure about Brazil. I would probably think the same. But um, but it did sort of sustain economic levels to some degree. People were at least able to continue it reduced sort of food insecurity for a lot of working or non-working Canadians. But at the end of the day, this was still a health crisis. And the economy could not rebound until we got the health crisis under control, which then opened the door to vaccination. So Canada today is the first country, the leading country in the world in terms of first doses. 75% of the population is vaccinated with one dose. And something like 18% of the population, including myself, very privileged, have received second doses. And so as the economy now is slowly reopening, and in the United States, they have fully reopened, we might see, in fact, a resurgence in economic activity. Today, the Federal Reserve has announced that, in the United States, has announced that they will be increasing interest rates in 2023. So they are expecting the economy to start rebounding fairly strongly throughout 2022. So maybe we'll be back to normal in 2023 with the health crisis under control. There's no reason that the economic crisis can be resolved, especially in light of Biden's fiscal intervention, which I'll have something to say about in a minute. But all of this to say that until the health crisis is resolved, traditional cane not sufficient. And so for now, the recovery is on the short term, the immediate, the urgency of getting everybody vaccinated. And so what happened during COVID is that you had, both in Canada and the United States, some massive fiscal intervention. And it contributed to a very dramatic bifurcation between national income and personal disposable income. Now, of course, because people kept receiving money but could not spend it. So the savings rate increased dramatically. Now, historically, the savings rate in Canada and the United States hovers around 2.5%. It was close to 30% in both countries, 34% in the United States. There was also a decline in overall household indebtedness. But this scenario masked important social class inequalities. There was certainly a very high increase of savings rates amongst, say, the 10% or the 20% of the population. But for many people in the lower income bracket, it actually led to more indebtedness. People in the service industry lost their jobs. Many couldn't pay rent. They did receive some, in Canada, some fiscal assistance of $2,000 a month. But, in Toronto, that doesn't even pay your rent. So many people at the lower end of the income ladder saw their debt increase, whereas people at the higher end saw their debt decrease, and in fact, their savings increase. And this is sort of what happened. And you can see in the first quarter of 2020, in Canada, real household disposable income in red, you can see that how this just massively increased. And whereas real gross domestic income in Canada in blue collapsed. And here collapsed a little bit less in the United States, but a similar pattern. And what happened here, in my opinion, this, I think, reflects COVID fatigue. So some states in the United States reopening, provinces in Canada reopening as well, and suffering for it. But that did allow people to start spending again. So I think this was COVID fatigue. People started going back to restaurants and forgetting the crisis existed. So, I said before that I think the COVID sort of represented a very remarkable end to this neoliberal creed. Huge deficits, unprecedented levels of public debt. So what? Did not generate inflation. Inflation was kept largely within target range in many countries, most countries. It did not lead to high interest rates. In fact, central banks were easily able to push interest rates to the low and keep them at the lower bound around the world. And some countries still have negative interest rates. The ECB, for example. So, I mean, this is the true nature of exogeneity of interest rates, right? The ability of central banks, as Keynes tells us to have any interest rates it wants. Now, that does not mean there's no repercussions to it, but central banks can have, and I do believe even in developing countries, they can have any interest rates they want. There will be repercussions on exchange rates and etc. But that's a different question. And despite huge deficits, we do not see collapsing savings. And so these are sort of a stark conclusions that completely contradict, more so now than during 2007. And so the question now is, what do we do from here? Will the profession take note? And, there are quite a number of dissident economists who are increasingly sort of saying, yeah, deficits are not a big problem. Barry Aikengreen is coming out with a book titled In Praise of Huge Deficits, which is quite remarkable. So I think that the austerity boogeyman has been sort of defrocked. Now, whether that's lasting or not, that's a different issue. But it does lead to a crisis. And we have other aspects of this neoliberal agenda. Globalization went dramatically into retreat, not only because borders closed and travel came to a standstill, but because major supply chains were disrupted as the pandemic ravaged economies of both industrialized and developing economies. Many governments overrode existing trade deals in order to secure what's needed to deal with the crisis. There were pressures to ensure industrial policies. We are having a large discussion in Canada about that. The idea of, reestablishing a national vaccine manufacturer laboratory, which was closed in the early 1990s by the conservative government because of austerity. So, we'll have to see how far this discussion goes. And so, I'm not going to go through all of this. But there were, changes to central banks in Canada. They both bought on the primary and secondary markets. I think in Europe as well, if I'm not mistaken. But monetary policy did have a consequence: the massive increase of stock market indexes around the world. It only took 8 months for the New York Stock Exchange to reach pre-COVID levels. And today, now at 30% above pre-COVID levels. And so you had a dramatic increase in wealth and inequality as a result of monetary policy. There's a story about Elon Musk, how his wealth grew by $100 billion between in only 6 months or so. So this is something that I think needs to be addressed, and I will address it in the next slide or so. And just like after 2007, are we witnessing or the exacerbation of the dual economy? And it's not only a dual economy, but it's also a gendered dual economy. There's lots of talk in the literature of she recoveries instead of recovery. Women have lost a lot during COVID. The labor market participation of women has plummeted more than men. So there are a gendered dimension to this crisis and to the recovery as well. And so the question that I raised before about the dual economy is whether this is sustainable in the long run. Now, from a post-Keynesian perspective, there's lots to discuss about structural changes brought about by monetary policy and fiscal policy. The ECB is starting to talk about the structural effects of monetary policy, which is quite remarkable, because if we talk about structural changes, you're talking about long-term effects of monetary policy, which contradicts the sacrosanct postulate of mainstream that monetary policy is neutral in the long run. So there's some exciting research being done on that level as well. But I just, love this quote. We cannot solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And this is completely à point for this crisis and for previous crises. As you all know, I'm preaching to the converted here. But it does raise the question about what kind of policies for the recovery and going beyond COVID. The first thing that we have to address is whether, like I mentioned before, is there another COVID crisis lurking or another type of financial crisis? If we adhere to the idea that capitalism is defined by repetitive crises, then, sort of in a Minsky, even in a Marxian sense, we have to prepare for the next crisis, sort of figure out what triggers these crises, a very difficult task. But if we are facing other sort of Keynesian type crises, we have to sort of the aggregate demand elephant in the room. Especially since, for me, one of the biggest myths that was busted during crisis was the idea that governments cannot afford such and such programs. We have been told many times that we don't have the money to pay for, national daycare or, full employment policies. Government can't spend that much money. But we've realized that governments can spend that kind of money, that there's no problem to increase the deficit 15-fold if we want to. And, we have to talk about the role of quantitative easing and how that made it easier. But the truth of the matter is, there is no such thing as austerity. There is no such thing as a budget constraint for the government. And we also know that such massive increases in fiscal expenditures did not lead to collapsing savings or increases in interest rates or, collapsing investments or et cetera, et cetera. So this was a very important sort of lesson, a hard lesson to learn. But in a way, if you want to talk in terms of silver linings, so we are sort of at this economic fork in the road. We can use this as a golden opportunity to move forward or return to austerity. Now, there are people who are claiming austerity, that we need to go back to balanced budgets, to sound finance. We are starting to hear these familiar arguments about our children and our grandchildren suffering. Um, but so far, uh, in Canada, in Canada at least, and in parts of Europe, even with Maastricht treaties, there's not this rush to sound finance. Even the conservatives are not, they might be saying, we need to re-examine, but they're certainly not pushing for balanced budgets. Um, and we do see moments of illumination, uh, wanting to build back better. Right now, we have to define it better for whom, what is better, how is better, and whether better is sufficient. Um, should we buy, we should build back better, fairer, greener, and we can add a couple of other adjectives in there. We have to have a discussion about better, what better is and what better means. But now the focus should be on long term. So if we are facing sort of secular stagnation, and how do we understand the causes of secular stagnation? For me, it's inequality, income and wealth inequality. I tell my students that income and wealth inequality is sort of the foundation to your house. And if your foundation is broken, then anything will contribute to your house collapsing. But if you have a very strong foundation, um, you know, your house can sustain a lot. So it's better to have a very strong foundation to support an economic economy. So that means reduced inequality, reduced wealth inequality. And that is in terms of the long term. So trying to deal with inequality to address the long term structural crisis in aggregate demand, because this really is what we are facing, a structural crisis in aggregate demand, and sort of to redress the failures of capitalism and how it has evolved in the last 40 years. Now, I think deficits and debt will largely resolve themselves as growth returns. This is certainly uh, uh, the prediction of the government in Canada and in the United States as well. We have some good people. Heather Boucher, who did her PhD in economics, advising the government, and we have some good people, heterodox people there. And the proof is in the pudding with Biden's rescue plan. But despite that, then what? Um, I'm a big advocate, as many of you know, of low interest rates, following sort of the papers I've written on post-Keynesian interest rate rules. Um, but speaking of recovery and spending, um, just sort of a little history lesson. FDR 1933 had a stimulus package of $42 billion, which was about 6% of GDP. We know that Keynes was very critical of FDR, saying it's not enough. Um, Obama in 2009 stimulus, 787 billion, but only 5.5% of GDP. Um, and we know that Krugman, dissident economists, mainstream, were very much telling the government it's not enough. But here we have Biden, who's coming. We have Biden, who's proposing a $1.9 trillion rescue plan, equivalent to 9% of current GDP. And the consensus amongst heterodox economists is that this is sufficient. This is good. This will have an impact. And so I'm a big proponent of massive fiscal spending. I've written a few papers, and now I'm doing an SFC model with a few people, um, where I show that larger fiscal multipliers arise with bigger spending. So if you want a huge fiscal multiplier impact, you have to have a huge um, deficit. And the preliminary research that we show that we're doing shows that 10% is about where you really see a dramatic increase in the multiplier. And this could go towards healthcare, daycare. In Canada, we have national healthcare. We are now adopting national daycare. We are talking about a national pharmacare, so prescriptions, pharmacies would all be subsidized. And you could certainly go to education. My university is proof that when governments cut back, universities declare bankruptcy. So it's an opportunity. But then I said, it's the economic fork in the road. Where the governments will go down that road is still, this is the last slide, still needs to be considered. So permanently lower interest rates. We need fiscal expenditures of about 10%. We need a commitment to full employment policies, to lower unemployment. We need a commitment to green policies, whether that involves central banks or just governments. Now, that's open to discussion. One of the books that's coming out in my series on central banks is on central banking monetary policy and the environment. And so some people have been arguing that monetary causal relationship, monetary policy affects the environment by encouraging low carbon industries to borrow when interest rates are too low. Um, and that climate change uh, increases risk and leads to higher interest rates. But that's a discussion that we could have. And certainly we need public banks that could address green policies, but that could address um, more local infrastructures. And we certainly need a huge arsenal of tax reforms to deal with inequality. So play with the tax system to make it increasingly progressive. We know that in the 60s and 70s, the highest marginal tax rate in Canada and the United States was 73%. Um, and we need financial transaction taxes to tax financial transactions as they occur, to discourage speculative. We need gender pay equality. We need productivity indexed wage growth. We need, a bunch of other that we can all think of. But this is certainly something that we need to address in the United States and in Canada. Jurisdictions are pushing and adopting for increased minimum wage, but we got to do a lot more than that. Um, and in the end, um, when we think about policies in a post-COVID world, this is, we're just talking about coming full circle back to heterodox economics. All these policies are something that any heterodox would have said maybe 10 years ago, 20 years ago, So it certainly speaks to the resilience uh, as opposed to mainstream or neoclassical economics, which has shown time and time again how it is sort of irrelevant or detached from the real world. Um, Heterodox have shown time and time again how it is relevant and realistic with respect to to the world in which we live. Thank you very much. 54 minutes, a lot more than I thought. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor. So now we can open to questions. So please, if you have a question, even in Portuguese, I can help you. I can try my best to translate the question to Professor. So you can say your question in Portuguese if you want. And we have Karen, please.
It's me?
Yep.
All right. Thanks so much, Louis-Philippe Rochon. It was very interesting. I have some brief comments and a final question. I agree with you that this crisis is completely different from the other one for two specific points that you show us. The first one, it was an exogenous shock, and the second one is it was not a demand crisis, but a supply crisis due to the lockdown that affect the total factor of productivity, mainly the labor market, right? And the second point that I agree with you is the fact that the fiscal and monetary stimulus, mainly because it was a lockdown crisis, a supply crisis, this stimulus was not sufficient to avoid the recession. For instance, in Brazil, the fiscal and monetary stimulus represent almost 8% of GDP, and the GDP fell last year 4.1%. Different from the 2007, 2008 crisis that fiscal and monetary stimulus were almost 2% and the GDP dropped only 0.1%, right? Then I agree with you. But the point, and I agree, of course, with your last slide, your proposal for, in terms of fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, green policy, and other things. But I think that this agenda works for developed countries, not for emerging countries, right? Because right now, and I'm looking specific to Brazilian economy, the Brazilian economic authorities are thinking right now that it's possible to bring back the old normal. The old normal is more austerity, more privatization, less state, and so on. The point is, if you continue with this old normal, I think that the process of stagnation you'll be permanent, mainly in emerging countries. What do you think about this one? Do you think that this agenda is more is possible to introduce this agenda in developed countries, or is also possible to introduce this agenda in emerging countries too?
Thank you. I always get this question. And I do think that from where I stand, I think that we share a lot there are a lot of similarities between developed and developing economies in terms of inequality, in terms of, all of those. But you guys seem to have a problem that we certainly don't have, and which is a problem of exchange rates and possible pass-through effects to inflation. And certainly, maybe it's a naive look, but that is certainly how I interpret developing or emerging economies in terms of a problem of exchange rate. Now, as I said, I think that there are a lot of these policies that can be adopted in emerging economies. One, fiscal policy, green policy, policies to deal with equality, land ownership, etc. But I think that one problem would always be monetary policy. And that's sort of how I interpret problems in emerging economies. what do you do about interest rates if they're too low, if they're, so that for me, and so for me, so to go from that to the next step would be to look at, regulations. I'm a big fan of regulation, and even when I advocate for low monetary policy, and people say, oh, it leads to financial bubbles, for example, I don't agree. I think what leads to financial bubbles are the lack of regulations. I think that it's always preferable to have low interest rates, and then you adopt some regulations to deal with the repercussions. And so I would say the same, and I think that it would be a very good uh, to develop, um, to look at specifically what kind of regulations would be needed in emerging economies to prevent negative consequences of certain. That's sort of how I would answer that question. I don't know if you agree on that. Now, the political feasibility is another issue. I doubt that's feasible under the current government in Brazil. Uh, but I do think it comes down, I mean, I think your emerging economies were devastated because of deregulation and privatization and all of the laissez-faire policies. And so we need to look at re-regulating economies.
Yeah, just one point. I think that is more difficult to implement this agenda post-COVID for a in emerging countries, mainly because the political situation changed from the left wing to the right wing. This is the point. But
Yeah.
Yes, but I agree with you.
Yeah. So no, yeah, like I said, under your current government, it's about political feasibility. What I said about I gave a talk a couple of months ago in front of some politicians and in Canada, and I said, um, COVID has taught us that there's no such thing as a budget constraint for the government. The idea that we cannot afford certain things is not true. And so when governments are saying we can't afford gender parity policies, we can't afford daycare, we can't afford these policies, what they're really saying is we don't want to deal with these policies. We don't want better living conditions for Indigenous people. We don't want gender parity policies. We don't want daycare. We don't want, so this is, and so, every politician was saying, no, I want it, but we just can't. And I'm going, no. You can't use that as an argument anymore. You can have these policies. Now, there might have some repercussions to it, and you might have to regulate your economy accordingly. But, thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Okay, more questions?
May I ask a question?
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Rochon, for your lecture. The idea of universal basic income has become more widespread during this pandemic here in Brazil. Even some conservative politicians are discussing this issue. But very little has been said about Brazil's high unemployment rate. And besides doing the same labor market reforms that Brazil has been done for the last 5 years. So my question is, from the point of view of emerging economy, would it be more feasible to adopt full employment policies than universal basic income from a post-Keynesian point of view? Thank you.
So I wrote a paper, I published a paper for a popular newspaper in Canada 2 years ago now, where I rejected UBI. And I said, UBI is an excuse for the government not to deal with unemployment. And I can certainly see that argument being much truer in Brazil. come on, there's a UBI, they can buy bread, they're fine. And it's a policy to dismiss the working class and to dismiss those who are most affected by our system. The truth of the matter is, a UBI pays 25% of what an income would pay, depending on, what the level of UBI would be, but, certainly would pay a lot less than what an income would pay. And I think that with a job, there's, employment is more than just making an income. It's about the self-worth, about contributing to the social project. So there's a lot of sort of sociological arguments that goes with creating jobs. So in that sense, I am 100% on board with, for example, the MMT people who are calling for an employer of last resort or something. But, an employer of last resort really is a full employment policy, right? And so I cannot be against the idea of people advocating for full employment. And so I applaud that. And so, yes, I would much rather the government focus their attention on full employment and giving people the dignity of work, the dignity of income, rather than UBI. Look, when the right agrees on a policy, we should think twice about that policy. Thank you, Pedro.
Rochon, let me just give you a data. If you consider that right now in Brazil, unemployment rate, employment precarization, and informal job, it represents almost 50% of the economic active population. We are talking about 50%. This is a crazy data. This is one reason why you have a lot of social problem right now. 50% of the economic active population. It's terrible.
Yeah. The one okay. Yeah.
Okay, additional questions? Okay, I have a question here. My question, Professor, Marxian economists, they did a lot of work in environmental economics, right? And it seems to me that, we have John Downey Foster, Paul Bouquet, and others working with environmental economics. It strikes me why post-Keynesians are a little bit late. I think it seems to me that they are doing research recently on environmental economics. So I'd like to hear your comments about it, and if you think it's crucial or not. So this is my first question. The second question is about the dual economy that you refer in your presentation. So is it the dual economy the same as the Lewis model, when you have a fragmented labor market, or it's something different? Because my concern here is about the expansionary policies, okay? So Keynesian policies, counter-cyclical policies, basically. Because in Brazil, one of the interpretations of the problems that we have in terms of structural change, it's not the only one, but it's one of them, is that after the Great Recession, we have a lot of stimulus from the government, and then we increase the share of sectors with low productivity, service sectors with low productivity, right? And following a Marxian perspective, I would say unproductive sectors, okay? So people like Amar Sheikh says that the counter-cyclical policies in Brazil didn't help. So if you can talk a little bit about it and explore a little bit more what's the cautions that we have to have in implementing counter-cyclical policies. And the last thing maybe is about the supply shock. Of course, there's a lot of debate. If it's exogenous shock or not, and we can say that it's always an endogenous shock because of the dynamics of capitalism. But it seems to me it's really a supply shock, and afterwards we have the adjustments of demand. It's a different crisis, as you said in the presentation. So the point is how to design stimulus policies that are sustainable. And it's a problem that happened in Brazil. So if you can explore a little bit about it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I heard your first question, but I'm having problems with my computer. Sometimes the sound shuts down. So and it has nothing to do with you. No, it's mine. I assure you it's mine. And ever since I got this, to help with Zoom, and anyways, I think it had some bad, so I didn't quite hear your two last questions. But let me first answer your first question. Yeah, for sure. I think post-Keynesians were late to discuss financialization as well. I mean, this was sort of a Marxist concept, and we're very late at discussing it. And I remember I had a conversation with Marc Lavoie years ago, and I gave a paper on financialization, and 15 years ago, and he wrote, and he said to me, he said, "Oh, you think financialization is important?" I said, I think it's going to be the topic for the next 20 years and more. And so he got into financialization, but we were late to that discussion. And I think with the environment, the same thing. Certainly post-Keynesians are late to the discussion, but there's some great work being done right now on stock flow consistent models and the environment. And it does not mean that being late to the conversation doesn't mean that what you're into it is not important. And so I think that there's a lot of really good, there's people at the Banque de France, some post-Keynesians like Romain Schwartzman, Godin. There's people at the French Development Bank doing some really good work on environmental policies from a post-Keynesian perspective. So, and then I couldn't quite hear what you said about dual economies and then counter-cyclical. Was that one question or the two questions?
Yes, two questions. Maybe I spoke too much and too fast. It happens sometimes because I'm an anxious person. Okay, it's about the meaning of the dual economy that you use in your presentation. The meaning of the dual economy. So is it the same meaning as the Lewis model when we have a segmented labor market, or it's something different? So if you can explain a little bit more. And the last question is about structural change. And basically, it's because in Brazil, one of the interpretations in Brazil is that after the Great Recession, basically of 2008, we have an expansion in service activities. Service activities with low labor productivity, sorry. So the question is how to design these counter-cyclical policies without stimulating sectors that are, in Marxist sense, unproductive.
So if I understand your question, for me, I use the dual economy in terms of really social classes. So not as much in terms of segmented labor markets, but in terms of workers versus rentiers. Sort of a financial asset class and a working class. And so you've had stagnating wages for the better part of the last 30 years, and you've had increasing profits or asset wealth. And this is sort of how I use the word dual economy. So it's sort of a class-based approach. So there. And as for the your last question, so anyways, from what I understood, there's been some structural change resulting from the 2007 financial crisis, which led to an increase in the service. And you want to know how we can use countercyclical fiscal policies.
Yeah, because
so go ahead.
It's actually a critique from Marx economics, right? So we have a lot of researchers that criticize countercyclical policies in terms of adverse effects. So we have Fred Mosley, for example, saying that countercyclical policies cannot increase profits. So it's a variable, very important for Marxists. So it's in this way my question.
Okay. Well, I'm not up on Marxist theory or Marxist policy, so I apologize. But you know, I'm an unrepentant Keynesian, so I do believe in countercyclical policies, absolutely. But more than that, you know, I believe in industrial policies and more. I mean, I don't know quite how to, you know, I've not read Fred Mosley's work that much and that attentively, so I don't think I can really answer that question in one way or another. Sorry about that. But, you know, for what it's worth, I'm a Keynesian, and so I defend countercyclical policies, but I agree that it's not enough. You have to talk in terms of other types of fiscal policies, industrial policies, and the likes.
Yeah, that's my question. So we in your view, as far as I know, we have to have a set of questions, you know, several policies that help to direct the economy to the right way.
Yeah. I mean,
the good way.
Well,
I mean, not the,
if your question is, should we just have countercyclical policies? No, that's certainly not sufficient. The government must be able to plan and strategize in terms of industrial policies, in terms of sectors, in terms of industries, in terms of, you know, all of that. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's my point. So, thank you. Okay, more questions? Let me see if we have some question on the YouTube. Okay, no questions. Students, if some students have questions, please, I can help with the English.
Sometimes people are ashamed, but Henrique, I think that 1 hour and a half, I think that is enough.
Yeah. I would say the same. Okay, okay, Professor. We are very many thanks for accepting our invitation. It was a great presentation.
Oh, my honor.
We enjoy a lot, and thank you.
Rochon,
thank you very much for having me, everyone.
Rochon, thank you very much. And let me tell you, remember that Marcelo and I are looking for we have to elaborate the proposal to present to the chair department, right? You remember this one, right?
Okay, perfect.
Don't
Yeah,
worry.
perfect. Thank
We
you.
didn't you
Thank
didn't
you.
forget this one, right? Don't worry, that's okay. It
Okay,
takes
no
time.
problem.